My name is Marian, and I started working in the financial industry nearly 20 years ago, not because I wanted a high powered career, but because I had to. My divorce left me with a 5-year-old son, Jake, and no support system except my own determination. My parents never seemed to have money or time for me, but somehow always had plenty for my sister Amy, who is 6 years younger than me. I remember the day I decided enough was enough. Jake needed new shoes for school. The soles of his old ones were practically falling off, and he'd been coming home with damp socks whenever it rained. When I asked my mom for help, you'd think I was asking for a diamond necklace. Marian, do you think money grows on trees? Mom sighed, her eyes narrowing as she reluctantly opened her wallet. Here's $30, make it work. You're always so resourceful anyway. $30 for children's shoes. I tried not to show my disappointment as Jake silently watched the exchange, his small hands squeezing mine. Later that same day, I watched from my parents' kitchen window as they took Amy shopping. She came home with 3 new outfits, an expensive handbag, and a fancy laptop for job hunting purposes. I did the rough calculation in my head while washing dishes. They'd spent at least $1,000 on her in one afternoon. It wasn't a one-time thing either. When I needed help with Jake's daycare fees after my hours were cut at work, Dad made me explain exactly why I couldn't manage on my own before handing over the cash with a lecture about financial responsibility. A grown woman with a child should have better planning skills, Marian, he said, his voice laced with disapproval. You can't keep coming to us every time you have a problem. You're not a teenager anymore. Meanwhile, Amy would throw tantrums about needing money for rent, then post vacation photos from Miami Beach the next week. My friend Sarah, who I've known since college, owned a small financial consulting firm called Capital Solutions. One day, while dropping Jake off at her house for a playdate with her daughter, I overheard her talking about needing weekend help with some client portfolios. I could do that for you, I said, surprising even myself with my boldness. I did minor in finance before I got married. Sarah looked at me thoughtfully. You know, that might work. We could start you part-time and see how it goes. She hired me that day. I worked evenings and weekends while Jake was either asleep or at scheduled playdates. The pay wasn't much at first, but it was mine. I didn't tell my parents. I knew they'd somehow find a way to diminish my achievement or suggest I give the money to Amy, who was really struggling with her job search that had mysteriously lasted 3 years. For 2 months, I worked and saved. I moved out of my cramped apartment into a slightly better one, bought Jake new clothes, and even started a small savings account. For the first time since my divorce, I felt a sense of control over my life. Then came the day it all blew up. Mom and Amy walked into Sarah's office on a Saturday afternoon. I was behind the computer analyzing a retirement portfolio. The look of shock on Mom's face would have been comical if I hadn't been so terrified of the interrogation I knew would follow. Marian, what are you doing here? She demanded, her designer purse clutched tightly against her chest as if to protect it from the surprise of seeing her daughter working. I work here, I said simply, continuing to type. Have for 2 months now. Mom didn't say anything else. She just stared at me, took Amy by the elbow, and left. I knew dinner at their house that Sunday would be interesting. When I arrived with Jake, both my parents were waiting at the kitchen table, their expressions a mixture of confusion and something that looked oddly like calculation. Why didn't you tell us you were working at a financial firm? Dad asked immediately, barely acknowledging Jake's greeting as my son slipped off to play video games in the living room. I set down the homemade apple pie I'd brought and shrugged. I didn't think you'd care. You've always been more interested in Amy's career prospects. Of course we care, Mom said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. How much are they paying you? The question hung in the air, its baldness surprising even me. When I told them I made about $3,000 a month between salary and bonuses, I saw something change in their expressions. It wasn't pride, it was calculation. Well, Dad said, clearing his throat, his fingers drumming against the faded tablecloth. Since you're doing so well now, I think it's only fair that you contribute to helping the family. Your mother and I aren't getting any younger, and our retirement savings aren't what they should be. I stared at him in disbelief, my hand frozen on the pie dish. What? Amy needs help with her rent again, Mom added, as if this explained everything. And we were thinking of helping her with a down payment on a condo. Those aren't cheap in this market, you know. That's when I understood. This wasn't about me contributing to my aging parents. This was about them taking my money to spend on Amy. Again, no, I said quietly but firmly. It's my money. I earned it. I'm raising a son alone, and I'm not giving you my hard-earned money for Amy's condo down payment. After that night, things changed. My parents did the bare minimum required by grandparents. They sent Jake a card on his birthday with $20 inside, bought him the cheapest clothes possible for Christmas, and occasionally asked how he was doing in school. Otherwise, I barely existed to them. When Jake had a piano recital at school, they claimed they were too tired to attend. When I was promoted to financial analyst, they didn't congratulate me. It was like I'd been demoted from daughter to distant acquaintance, and not a welcome one. Thankfully, I had Ruth, my former mother-in-law. Unlike my ex-husband Richard, who vanished after our divorce, Ruth remained steadfastly in our lives. She started coming to Jake's school events, cheering louder than anyone else's grandparents. She'd take us shopping occasionally and listen to my problems over Sunday dinners at her cozy house in the suburbs. You know, Marion, she said one evening as we sat on her porch swing watching Jake play with her neighbor's dog. I've never understood why your parents treat you the way they do. You're the most responsible, hardworking person I know. I sighed, watching Jake's carefree smile as he threw a tennis ball. I've stopped trying to understand it. Maybe they just connect better with Amy's personality. Ruth snorted. That's no excuse for parents to play favorites. You deserve better, and so does Jake. By the time Jake was in middle school, I was working full-time at Capital Solutions, having risen to senior analyst. I'd saved nearly all my money beyond our living expenses, applying for every professional development opportunity I could find. I knew career advancement was my ticket to financial security for Jake and me. On Jake's 13th birthday, my parents showed up for exactly 15 minutes. They took a couple of photos, then Mom checked her watch. We promised to help Amy pick out furniture for her new place. She's been so patient waiting for us today. They left before Jake even blew out the candles on his cake. But Ruth stayed. She whooped and hollered when Jake opened her gift, a refurbished laptop for his schoolwork, and took us out for ice cream afterward. 2 weeks later, at a rare family dinner at my parents' house, I decided to share my news. I've been offered a department head position at Apex Financial. I start next month. That's nice, Dad interrupted, not even looking up from his plate. More potatoes, Amy? I felt a familiar sting of disappointment, but pressed on. It comes with a significant salary increase and better hours, which will be good for Jake. My mother nodded absently, then turned to Amy. Tell Marion about your new volunteer position, honey. She's going to be helping organize that charity fashion show. As Amy launched into a detailed explanation of her unpaid work arranging table centerpieces, I realized I felt nothing. No anger, no disappointment, just nothing. I'd finally accepted that my accomplishments would never matter to them. The next day, I called Ruth. I'm thinking of moving to a better school district for Jake, I told her. The promotion makes it possible. That's wonderful news, she said warmly. I'm so proud of you, Marion. You've worked so hard for this. 2 months later, Jake and I moved into a modest 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood with excellent schools. Living with Ruth during the transition period was nothing like living with my parents. She treated me like an actual person instead of a burden, and Jake thrived under her genuine affection. I'm going to help you with the down payment, she told me one evening as we sat on her patio, watching Jake practice shooting baskets. Don't argue with me about it. Ruth, that's too much, I said, genuinely shocked by her generosity. She waved her hand dismissively. What else am I going to do with my money? My retirement funds are secure, and I intend to use what's left to help the people I love. You and Jake are at the top of that list. At Apex Financial, I thrived. I started as a department head, which basically meant I managed a team of analysts and took responsibility for our largest clients. I stayed late, came in early, and volunteered for the projects others avoided. My boss, Mr. Harris, noticed my dedication. After 3 years of nonstop work, I was promoted to senior director. With it came another salary increase, my own corner office, and more responsibilities. Instead of slowing down, I worked even harder, aware that as a woman in finance, I had to be twice as good to get half the recognition. Meanwhile, Jake grew into a thoughtful, intelligent teenager. At 16, he was already talking about college and career plans. Unlike me at his age, he had stability, support, and options. That was worth every late night and missed weekend. Mr. Harris called me into his office one day, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his expression serious. "Marion, I'm putting you in charge of the Griffin account." My heart nearly stopped. Griffin Enterprises was one of our biggest clients, known for being particularly demanding and having rejected 3 previous financial advisors. "Are you sure?" I asked, straightening in my chair. "Absolutely," he nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You've earned this chance. Don't mess it up." He smiled, but I knew he was serious. This account could make or break my career at Apex. For the next 3 months, I lived and breathed the Griffin account. I redesigned their entire investment portfolio, finding ways to increase returns while reducing risk. I spent countless nights at my dining room table surrounded by spreadsheets and market analyses, often falling asleep there until Jake would gently wake me and insist I go to bed. "Mom, you're working too hard," he'd say, concern evident in his young face that looked so much like mine. "It's just for a little while, honey," I'd reassure him. This account is really important. When I finally presented my plan to the Griffin board, they were silent for a full minute after I finished. The conference room felt suffocatingly quiet, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Well," Mr. Griffin said, his imposing frame leaning back in his chair, "finally, I think we found our financial advisor. This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we've been looking for." Not only did we keep their business, but they increased their investment with us by 30%. Mr. Harris was ecstatic. He called a company meeting to recognize my achievement, gave me a substantial bonus, and increased my salary again. That night, I called Ruth to share the good news. "I knew you could do it," she said proudly, her voice warm over the phone. "You've always been brilliant with numbers." "The bonus is significant," I told her. "I'm thinking of starting a college fund for Jake." "That's wonderful, dear," Ruth replied. "But please tell me you're going to do something for yourself too. You deserve a break. You've been working nonstop for years." "Actually, I am," I told her, excitement bubbling up. "And I've got something for you too." The next day, I visited Ruth with 2 envelopes. One contained a beautiful silver bracelet with her birthstone I bought as a thank you gift. The other held 2 tickets for a luxury Alaskan cruise. "You and me," I explained as she opened the second envelope in shock. "Next month, all expenses paid. Jake will stay with his friend's family. I've already arranged it." For the first time in my life, I saw Ruth speechless. Her eyes welled up with tears as she pulled me into a tight hug. "You wonderful girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve you." Our cruise was incredible. Glaciers, whales, northern lights, we saw it all. For 10 days, I didn't check my work email or worry about client portfolios. I just enjoyed being with Ruth, who at 75 still had more energy and curiosity than most people have her age. I posted photos on social media, something I rarely did, partly to remember the trip and partly, I admit, to show off a little. Look at us now. 3 days after we returned, my phone rang. It was a number I rarely saw on my caller ID these days. "Mom," I answered, genuinely surprised. "Marion, darling." Her voice was syrupy sweet, with a warmth I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "It's been too long. In fact, we were hoping you'd come over for dinner this Sunday. Your father is grilling steaks, your favorite." I should have said no. I knew there had to be a reason for this sudden interest in my existence after years of near silence, but curiosity got the better of me. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "What time? And is it okay if Jake comes too?" 6 o'clock. And of course Jake should come. "We've missed our grandson." The lies were so blatant I didn't even bother responding. I just told her I'd see them Sunday and hung up. That Sunday, I drove to my parents' house feeling strangely detached. Jake sat beside me, playing a game on his phone, occasionally glancing at me with concern. You okay, Mom? He asked as we pulled into the driveway. I'm fine, sweetie, I reassured him, though my stomach was in knots. Just remember that whatever happens in there, it's not about you, okay? The house looked exactly the same. Same faded blue paint, same flower beds that Mom obsessed over, same basketball hoop that Dad had installed for the neighbor kids, not for Jake. I'd offered to buy one for our own driveway years ago, but Jake had shrugged and said he preferred soccer anyway. Mom opened the door before I could knock, her smile wide and welcoming. Dad stood behind her, actually looking happy to see us. It was disconcerting. Marion, Jake, Mom exclaimed, hugging us both tightly. I returned the hug awkwardly, while Jake stood stiff in his grandmother's embrace, unaccustomed to such affection from her. You both look fantastic. Jake, you've grown so tall. They ushered us inside, offering drinks and appetizers like we were honored guests instead of family they'd barely acknowledged for years. The conversation was unnervingly pleasant, focusing on neutral topics like the weather and neighborhood news. Jake answered their questions about school politely but briefly, his eyes occasionally darting to me with confusion. Finally, when we sat down to eat, Dad cleared his throat, setting down his fork with deliberate care. So, Marion, tell us about your job. Sarah mentioned you're some kind of executive at Apex Financial now? As a department head or something? I carefully avoided answering my father's thinly veiled question about my position and salary. I knew exactly where this conversation was heading, and a familiar weariness settled over me. I'm doing well, I said vaguely, cutting a piece of steak that was far too overcooked. The company is great, and I enjoy the work. And Jake, Mom jumped in, turning to my son with exaggerated interest. How's school? Are you thinking about colleges yet? Before Jake could answer, I changed the subject. How's Amy doing? Is she around? The question worked like a charm. My parents' faces instantly shifted from eager to troubled, exchanging a quick glance that confirmed my suspicions. Actually, Mom said with a heavy sigh, smoothing her napkin repeatedly, Amy's having a bit of a difficult time. She had to leave that volunteer position. They just didn't appreciate her creative input. Dad jumped in, his voice lowered with practiced concern. And my business hasn't been what it used to be since I semi-retired. The economy's been tough on small businesses like mine. We're barely keeping up with the mortgage payments, and Amy's still living with us, you know. I put down my fork, the sound of metal against porcelain surprisingly loud in the sudden tension. I'm sorry to hear that. It must be difficult. They exchanged another look that confirmed exactly why I'd been invited to dinner. Mom reached across the table and took my hand, her eyes suddenly watery. Marion, honey, we know we weren't always the most supportive parents. We made mistakes, terrible mistakes. The way we treated you compared to Amy, it wasn't fair. I sat there, letting their words wash over me, studying the sudden appearance of remorse on their faces. Were they genuinely remorseful or just desperate for money? Probably both, I decided. But too little, too late. We're so proud of you, Mom continued, squeezing my hand with surprising strength. And we're hoping maybe you could find it in your heart to help your family, just until we get back on our feet. Your father's medical bills have been piling up, and with Amy still trying to find herself, there it was, the real reason for the sudden family reunion. I glanced at Jake, who was staring intently at his plate, clearly uncomfortable. I wanted to refuse, to tell them they'd made their bed and could lie in it, but something stopped me. Maybe it was Ruth's words about kindness not being weakness, or maybe it was the realization that I could afford to help them without hurting myself or Jake financially. How much do you need? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Relief flooded their faces, and Dad actually teared up, though whether from emotion or calculated effect, I couldn't tell. Just enough to help with the bills and the mortgage, maybe $1,000 a month. I nearly choked on my water. That was a significant sum, the same amount Ruth had given me for housing during my early career struggles. But my recent promotion and bonus meant I could manage it without compromising Jake's college fund. I can do that, I said finally, setting down my glass. I'll set up a monthly transfer. They both burst into tears, thanking me profusely. Jake looked at me with questions in his eyes, but stayed silent. I felt nothing, no warmth, no reconnection, just a vague sense that I was doing the right thing despite them not deserving it. When I told Ruth about my decision the next day over coffee at her house, she surprised me by nodding slowly. You know, there's a difference between being taken advantage of and choosing to help even when it's not deserved, she said, stirring her tea thoughtfully. You're a better person than they are. That's something to be proud of. I just don't want to be like them, I admitted. I don't want to turn my back on family, even if they turn their backs on me. Ruth squeezed my hand. Just make sure you're setting boundaries. Helping doesn't mean letting them drain you dry. Over the next few months, I saw my parents more frequently, occasionally joining them for Sunday dinners, sometimes with Amy when she was in the mood to grace us with her presence. She hadn't changed a bit, still self-centered, still treated like a princess by her parents. But what struck me most was her appearance. Despite their supposed financial troubles, Amy's clothes were designer brands, her nails professionally done, and she sported a new MacBook and iPhone. I didn't mention it. I kept sending the money each month, and my parents kept thanking me with over-the-top gratitude that felt increasingly hollow. Then they started asking for more, small amounts at first. The water heater broke. Could you help with $300? The car needs repairs. Would $500 be too much to ask? I rarely said no. My career was thriving, Jake was doing well in school, and I told myself it was just money. At work, I was assigned to lead a major project, restructuring our approach to corporate clients. If successful, it would likely lead to a vice president position. I threw myself into it, working longer hours than ever, grateful that Jake was old enough to be more independent. Finally, after months of work, my project concluded successfully. The CEO personally congratulated me, and the promotion I'd been hoping for came through. Vice President of Corporate Relations, with a salary nearly double what I'd been making. I bought an expensive bottle of champagne and drove straight to Ruth's house to celebrate. She answered the door in her gardening clothes, soil still on her hands, but her face lit up when she saw the champagne. I got the promotion, I announced, unable to keep the pride from my voice. Of course you did, she exclaimed, pulling me into a tight hug regardless of her dirty hands. Come in, come in. I want to hear everything. We sat on her back porch, drinking champagne from her best crystal glasses as afternoon turned to evening. The weight of achievement sat comfortably on my shoulders for once, instead of feeling like another burden of expectation. I'm so proud of you, she said, clinking her glass against mine. But promise me now you'll take some time for yourself. All work and no play isn't good for anyone, no matter how successful they become. I will, I agreed, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. I'm thinking of taking Jake to Europe next summer before he starts his senior year. And maybe, I hesitated, maybe I'll even start dating again. Hallelujah, she laughed, her eyes crinkling with genuine joy. It's about time. A week later, I made time to visit my parents for dinner. Jake begged off, citing a school project, but I suspected he simply wanted to avoid the tension that always lingered in my parents' house. Amy was home from whatever she did during the day, and I noticed she had a new designer handbag that probably cost more than my first month's rent in my post-divorce apartment. I got promoted, I announced during dinner, trying to share my accomplishment, a small part of me still hoping for genuine happiness on their behalf. A strange silence fell over the table. Mom and Dad exchanged that familiar look, the one that always preceded a request for money. Then Mom said, her voice carefully casual, you know, with your new position, you could probably afford to help us a bit more. Maybe $1,500 a month instead of $1,000. I laughed, thinking she was joking. I've already been helping for months, plus covering all those emergency expenses. Amy rolled her eyes, examining her freshly manicured nails. Don't be so selfish, Marion. It's not like you need all that money for yourself and Jake. You've always been so tight with money. Coming from her, with the $800 bag sitting next to her plate, it was too much. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it, bitter and familiar. No, I said firmly, placing my fork down with deliberate calm. The amount stays the same. The rest of dinner was tense, with disapproving glances from all three of them. I left early, unsettled by how quickly their gratitude had morphed into entitlement, but also oddly relieved. At least now I knew where I stood. Nothing had changed, and perhaps nothing ever would. Months passed. Amy finally got a part-time job at a boutique, a fact I learned when Mom called to invite me to a celebration dinner. She's finally finding her career path, Mom gushed. We're so proud. I agreed to go, more out of curiosity than any real desire to celebrate Amy's entry into the workforce at age 39. I arrived at their house expecting other guests, but it was just the four of us. Amy proudly announced she'd been working for 2 whole weeks and was planning to celebrate her career milestone with a luxury resort trip to Mexico. I need a break after all this hard work, she explained, scrolling through resort photos on her phone. Look at this infinity pool. Mom cleared her throat, setting down her wine glass with careful precision. We were hoping you might pay for Amy's trip as a sort of job congratulations gift. I stared at them in disbelief, my fork suspended halfway to my mouth. Excuse me? It would mean so much to her, Dad added, his expression earnest. After all her hard work getting this position. Amy nodded eagerly, showing me her phone. It's only $14,000 for the package I want. That's nothing for someone like you. I put down my fork, the metal clanking against fine china that my parents only use for special occasions. Amy hasn't earned a single dollar that wasn't immediately spent on herself. Why would I spend that kind of money on her vacation when I've been helping you with bills for almost a year? If you don't help your sister, Mom threatened, her sweet facade crumbling instantly, don't consider yourself part of this family anymore. I looked at them, my entitled sister, my manipulative mother, my weak father, and felt nothing but release. The last thin threads of obligation snapped clean. Fine by me, I said calmly, standing up and reaching for my purse. And by the way, I'm stopping the monthly transfers too. You can figure out your own finances from now on. As I walked to my car, I heard them calling after me, their voices shifting from anger to panic, but I didn't look back. When I got home, Jake was in the living room doing homework, and he looked up when I walked in. You're back early, he observed, his perceptive eyes scanning my face. Everything okay? Actually, yes, I replied, and meant it. I think I finally just freed myself from a very old burden. I immediately canceled the automatic transfer in my banking app, feeling lighter with each tap of my finger. For weeks, they bombarded me with calls and texts. I blocked their numbers. Emails came next, alternating between guilt trips and apologies. I filtered them to trash. A month after cutting ties with my parents and Amy, I received an invitation to Ruth's 75th birthday party. She was hosting a celebration at her house, inviting family members and friends from all over. I knew my parents would likely attend. She was still Dad's mother after all, but I figured we could avoid each other in a crowd. The day of the party arrived, and I dressed carefully in a blue dress Ruth had always said brought out my eyes. Jake wore a button-down shirt and khakis, looking startlingly grown up. I brought Ruth a hand-painted teapot I'd commissioned from a local artist, knowing her love for unique tea sets. When we arrived, the house was already filled with people. I spotted my parents and Amy immediately. They were standing by the buffet table, already filling their plates. They saw me too, but turned away without acknowledging me. That suited me fine. Jake and I made our way to Ruth, who was holding court in her favorite armchair, looking elegant in a purple dress with a corsage pinned to her shoulder. There's my girl and my handsome grandson, she said, her face lighting up as we bent to hug her. Always on time, always thoughtful. I gave her my gift, which she opened immediately, gasping with delight at the teapot. It's absolutely beautiful, she said, turning it in her hands to admire the hand-painted wildflowers. I'll use it tomorrow for my morning tea. The party progressed pleasantly enough. Jake found some younger cousins to talk to, and I chatted with relatives I hadn't seen in years, caught up with some of Ruth's friends, and successfully avoided any interaction with my immediate family. Then came time for dinner. The meal began cordially enough, with everyone passing dishes and making small talk. I sat with Jake at the opposite end of the long table from my parents and Amy, with Ruth at the head of the table. When the main course was served, People began offering toast to Ruth. My mother stood up, wine glass in hand, her voice carrying across the table. To my wonderful mother-in-law on her 75th birthday, she said, smiling broadly. You've always been a beacon of wisdom in our family, and we're so grateful for your guidance over the years. Her words were pretty but hollow, and I had to suppress an eye roll as I sipped my water. Then, to my horror, she turned in my direction, her smile tightening. And while I have everyone's attention, I'd like to address something personal. Her voice took on a wounded tone that I recognized all too well. My daughter Marion has recently decided that family isn't important to her. She's turned her back on us despite her financial success, refusing to help her own sister with a simple graduation gift. A shocked silence fell over the table. Jake's hand found mine under the tablecloth, squeezing tightly. My face burned with embarrassment and anger, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. Diana, Ruth said sharply, setting down her fork with a clatter. This is hardly the time or place. But I'd had enough. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Since my mother has decided to air our dirty laundry at Ruth's birthday dinner, let me set the record straight. I looked around the table at the uncomfortable faces. For the past year, I've been sending my parents $1,000 every month because they claimed they needed help paying bills and keeping their house. My father's cousin Martin, who worked at the bank where my parents had their mortgage, frowned and put down his fork. That can't be right. Richard and Diana refinanced their mortgage last year and reduced their payments significantly. I handled the paperwork myself. The table went utterly silent. All eyes turned to my parents, whose faces had drained of color. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. All this time, they'd been lying to me about their financial situation. I suddenly understood why Amy always had designer clothes and expensive accessories while supposedly struggling at home with our financially strained parents. You weren't using my money for necessary bills at all, were you? I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. You were using it to continue spoiling Amy, just like you always have. Is this true? Ruth asked, her voice dangerously quiet as she looked at her son. My father stammered. It's not what it looks like, Mother. What exactly is it supposed to look like? I found my voice, shock turning quickly to rage. You took $12,000 from me under false pretenses in just a year. You made me believe you were struggling to keep your home when you were actually funding Amy's shopping addiction and planning luxury vacations. My mother tried to recover, her voice trembling. We needed that money for other things, family things. Ruth slowly stood up, her small frame suddenly imposing. Richard, Diana, I think you should leave. Now. Mom, please. Dad began, his face ashen. No. Her voice was firm, each word like a stone dropping in the silent room. You lied to your daughter. You took advantage of her success and generosity. You are no son of mine right now. She turned to Amy, who was staring down at her plate. And you, did you know about this, Amy? Amy's silence was answer enough. All of you, out of my house, Ruth continued, her disappointment palpable. And Richard, you should know that I will be revisiting my will. I have no intention of leaving anything to people who would behave this way. My parents and Amy left quickly, my mother in tears, my father red-faced with shame. The party dispersed soon after, guests making awkward excuses to leave early. Jake and I stayed to help Ruth clean up, all three of us working in contemplative silence. I'm sorry, I finally said, storing leftover cake in Ruth's refrigerator. I ruined your party. Nonsense. She patted my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. You didn't ruin anything. They did that all on their own. Jake, who had been quietly listening to everything, spoke up. Grandma Ruth, how come you're so different from Dad and the rest of them? Ruth smiled sadly at him. Sometimes people make choices that define their character, sweetheart. I chose to value honesty and kindness. Others make different choices. In the weeks that followed, Ruth told me my parents called her constantly, begging forgiveness and pleading with her not to change her will. She was unmoved. I already changed it, she informed me one afternoon over tea served in her new teapot. The house and most everything else will go to you and Jake. You're the ones who've shown real character in this family. I sipped my tea, feeling sad but relieved. I never wanted it to come to this. Neither did I, she sighed, gazing out at her garden. But we can't control other people's choices, Marion. We can only control our own. Jake adjusted beautifully to our simpler family circle. In fact, he seemed happier without the tension of my parents' conditional affection. We spent more time with Ruth, helping in her garden, taking her to medical appointments, and having Sunday dinners at her house. I started dating again, casually at first, then meeting someone who understood the value of honesty and respect. I haven't spoken to my parents or Amy since that day at Ruth's birthday party. Occasionally, I see their names pop up on my phone, but I never answer. Whatever they have to say, it's too late. Ruth was right. We can't control other people's choices. We can only control our own. And I've chosen peace.